long before the great scrolls arrived, before cedar rafters carried the weight of 1,000,000 words, before even the scent of lavender oil perfumed the halls of wisdom, there was only marsh. Brackish water lapped against flattened banks of silt and reed. Ibises waded ankle-deep through the delta's woven channels, and the occasional fishing canoe, carved from sycamore, bobbed gently in the breeze. This was not yet Alexandria. This was the sleepy Egyptian fishing village of Rakotis, dusty, damp, and old. Ancient in its own right, but not the sort of place one would expect to host the mind of the known world. But history, like rivers, favors convergence. The year was 331 BCE. The man was Alexander III of Macedon, already known to the world as Alexander the Great. In his short but volcanic life, he had marched eastward from Greece to India, conquering every empire in his path. Egypt, rich in grain, gold, and mystique, had fallen into his lap with barely a sword drawn. The priests of Memphis had crowned him pharaoh, the embodiment of Horus on earth. But Alexander was no mere conqueror of land. He wanted to conquer time. One story, told often by admiring Greek historians, says that Alexander stood on the coast of Rakotis and drew a city in the sand with his spear, a harbour shaped like a sickle, 2 ports divided by an island, streets in a grid like Athens, temples, walls, and beside them all, a palace of learning. Whether this moment truly happened is irrelevant. It was believed, and belief, in time, shapes reality. Thus, Alexandria was born, not from soil, but from vision. After Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BCE, his empire fractured into rival shards. His body, preserved in honey and carried in a golden sarcophagus, became a relic too precious to bury. Amid this chaos, one of his closest generals, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, made a bold move. He intercepted the funeral procession and brought Alexander's body to Egypt, declaring himself satrap, then king, of this ancient land. It was not a theft, it was a foundation. If the body of the world's greatest conqueror lay in your capital, your legitimacy was unshakable. Ptolemy named himself Soter, the savior, and he began to shape Alexandria, not as a Greek colony, but as the brain of a new empire. Hellenistic Egypt. Ptolemy. I was not only a warrior, but also a thinker. In his court were mathematicians, astronomers, and orators. He had studied under Aristotle himself, and among the most important arrivals to his fledgling kingdom was a man who carried no sword, wore no armor, and brought no battalions, only scrolls. His name was Demetrius of Phaleron. Demetrius had once ruled Athens as a kind of philosopher king, appointed by the Macedonians as a steward of their will. He had been popular for a time, admired for his oratory and reforms, but power in Greece was fragile. In the upheaval following Alexander's death, Demetrius was ousted, exiled, and forced to flee. But exile is not always a death sentence. Sometimes it is a second act. Ptolemy welcomed Demetrius with open arms and saw in him not just a scholar, but an architect of culture. Together, they envisioned something that had never existed before, not merely a repository of texts, but a living sanctuary of knowledge, a place where every word worth remembering could be stored, every poem, treatise, ritual, chart, hymn, medical note, and mathematical proof, a place where knowledge could be gathered from across the world, protected, translated, copied, and expanded. This would not be a library in the modern sense, not simply books on shelves. It would be something far more ambitious, a mausion, a temple to the muses. In its heart would stand the great library. The mausion was not just a building, it was a complex, a scholarly utopia. Dinocrates of Rhodes, Alexander's famed city architect, had died by then, but his students and apprentices remained. Under Demetrius's guidance, they drew up a plan that was equal parts temple, academy, laboratory, dormitory, and archive. The precinct would include long colonnaded walkways where philosophers could walk and debate, shielded from the sun, gardens of medicinal herbs used for science and health, lecture halls and lecture stowey, where ideas were not just stored, but performed, dining halls, where scholars would eat at the state's expense, an unheard-of luxury, and at the center, towering above them all, the bibliotheca, the library. It would be built with thick limestone walls and cedar beams imported from Lebanon, chosen for their ability to repel insects and mold. The ceilings would be high and airy, drawing in the breeze from the Mediterranean. The floors, polished marble. To protect the scrolls from humidity, underground storage rooms would be built, stabilized with sand and air ducts. The scale was daunting, the logistics unthinkable, but Ptolemy, I committed himself. He set aside land, ordered the royal treasury opened, and gave Demetrius authority to recruit the brightest minds from across the known world. A revolution in knowledge had begun, not with a bang, but with a foundation stone laid in salt and wind. Books in the 3rd century BCE did not travel easily. They were fragile, precious, and rare. Most were written on papyrus, harvested from the Nile itself. Papyrus was cut, flattened into sheets, glued end to end into long rolls, and dried in the sun. Each scroll might take weeks to prepare and months to copy. And yet, the great library grew, faster than anyone expected. That was because of one of the most radical royal decrees in history. Every ship that entered the harbor of Alexandria would be searched for books. If a merchant or captain had scrolls aboard, whether private letters, technical manuals, or foreign poetry, they were confiscated, but not in malice. Scribes copied them at lightning speed. The original was kept in the library. The copy, often of better quality, was returned with gratitude and compensation. Over time, Alexandria became the greatest book trap in history. That wasn't all. Agents of the library were sent across the known world to buy, borrow, or barter for texts. They visited the temples of Memphis and Thebes. They negotiated with scholars in Babylon. They paid dearly for works from India, Persia, and even Carthage. Some stories claim they obtained the Hebrew Torah, translating it into Greek as the Septuagint. The ambition was nothing less than totality. If a scroll existed, the library wanted it. If it didn't, they wanted it copied, translated, and preserved. All this created a new problem. With thousands upon thousands of scrolls flooding into the city, how could anyone find anything? The answer lay in the hands of the library's first head librarian, a scholar named Zenodotus of Ephesus. Zenodotus did more than simply stack scrolls by topic. He invented systems. He arranged scrolls alphabetically by author, a revolutionary idea at the time. He used tags, called syllaboi, that hung from each scroll with the title, author, and first line written clearly. He began the process of editing and comparing manuscripts. Not all copies agreed, and Zenodotus was among the first to declare which lines were authentic and which were spurious. He was a poet too, and an editor of Homer. His work laid the groundwork for a field we now call textual criticism. But in his time, it was something new, the curation of civilization. The great library was no longer just a warehouse of scrolls. It had become an instrument, a thinking machine that processed the mind of the ancient world. Let us pause for a moment and imagine what the library looked like in its prime. You walk beneath a gate of carved limestone, the air cool despite the heat outside. The walls are lined with alcoves, each filled with scrolls. Some rooms are dimly lit to preserve fragile texts. Others are bright, with windows open to the sea breeze. You hear the soft murmur of students reciting verse or debating the structure of the atom. You smell cedar, ink, parchment, lavender. In one wing, copyists work in silence, transcribing Egyptian hymns into Greek. In another, scholars examine the stars, refining Babylonian charts with new geometry. Some rooms are devoted to medicine, with scrolls on human anatomy and surgical tools nearby. Others house drama and poetry, preserving the work of playwrights whose names will otherwise be forgotten by time. The entire structure is alive, not with machines, but with minds. This is not merely a place to read the world. It is a place to rebuild it. And yet, all of this, the limestone and cedar, the scrolls and syllables, the sweat of scribes and brilliance of philosophers, began before the first scroll was ever shelved. It began with a dream, an exile, and a king. It began in a city not yet built, on a coast not yet known, among people who could not possibly have imagined that the place they stood would one day be called the brain of the world. Before the first scroll, there was only the question, what if every word could be gathered and never lost again? The Library of Alexandria was built to answer it. Before it housed scrolls or scholars, the great library was only a question scratched into stone. How do you build a home for human memory? How do you make thought endure? Demetrius of Phaleron and Ptolemy. Isota envisioned not a building, but a civilizational engine, a beacon of collected truth shining outward across the Mediterranean world. Not a temple to the gods, but to their daughters, the 9 muses, patrons of the arts, sciences, and memory itself. Hence the name, Mausion, not just museum in the modern sense, but a full sanctuary of intellect. And like the nearby lighthouse of Pharos, which would soon rise to guide ships into Alexandria's harbor, the library would guide civilizations into the unknown waters of time. This was not to be a modest repository. It was to be the greatest center of knowledge the world had ever known, and that meant the construction needed to be both practical and symbolic, both majestic and efficient. And, crucially, it had to last. The site chosen for the library and Mausion complex was in the Bruchaion quarter, part of Alexandria's royal zone, nestled between the palace, the harbor, and the cultural center of the city. It would be visible to every visitor arriving by sea, and it would sit under the eye of the king. It was no coincidence that Alexandria had already been laid out on a Hippodamian grid, a rational, right-angled structure of avenues, courts, and stoae. The city itself mirrored Greek ideals of balance and clarity, and the library would be its cerebral cortex. Demetrius and the architects envisioned a sprawling layout, a central domed archive hall, built with thick stone walls and a raised foundation to mitigate flooding. Underground scroll vaults, kept dry and cool by natural airflow and aromatic fumigation. Wide porticos and peristyles, where scholars could pace and lecture, shaded from the blistering Egyptian sun. Lecture theatres, some open air, others enclosed, to host ongoing public discourse and private instruction. Scriptoria, where trained scribes would copy texts with disciplined speed. Gardens, not just for beauty, but to cultivate herbs used in ink-making and preservation. Thyme, lavender, mint, myrrh. Living quarters, dining rooms, and private study spaces for scholars, free of charge, at royal expense. At the library's peak, it would resemble a small university town. Scholars might live there for years without setting foot beyond its walls. All of it dedicated to one mission: to capture and cultivate every form of human knowledge. Much of the stone used in the construction came from nearby Tura limestone quarries, the same source that once built the inner chambers of the pyramids. But where the pyramids had been designed to endure by brute force, the library was designed to breathe. The inner walls were lined with cedar wood, imported at enormous cost from the mountains of Lebanon, chosen for its aromatic resin and its natural resistance to rot, moths, and mildew. Cedar didn't just protect scrolls, it scented the halls, giving the library a distinctive, memory-anchored smell. Earthy, clean, sacred. Marble from Asia Minor paved the floors of the main atrium, and columns of red granite, quarried in Aswan and floated down the Nile, were polished until they reflected torchlight like water. Papyrus was harvested in bulk from marshes around Lake Mareotis. Its production became a semi-royal monopoly, tightly controlled to support the copyist army the library would soon require. Even the lamps were carefully designed. Bronze oil lamps were suspended from ceiling hooks and fed with lavender-infused wicks, chosen not only to scent the air, but also because lavender's smoke discouraged book-damaging insects. Every element of the construction was chosen with a librarian's foresight. Beauty was nothing if it could not also preserve. Demetrius oversaw not just stone and scaffolding, but intellectual architecture. How would scrolls be categorized? How many copies should be made of each work? What languages would be accepted and which translated? Where would foreign scholars sleep? Could poets and physicists work side by side without murdering each other? Demetrius and his staff began drawing up plans as meticulous as the blueprints of the walls. They didn't just want a place to store ideas, they wanted to nurture them. To that end, the Mausion was also designed to support daily life for its residents. Scholars would be paid by the state, liberating them from economic distraction, fed and housed, with room and board inside the library precinct, given scribes so their dictations could be recorded in real time, offered healthcare using herbal remedies developed on site. It was an ancient research grant, thousands of years before the term existed. The thinkers of the library were not mere readers. They were researchers, debaters, educators, and translators, and they lived together under the same roof. Construction advanced rapidly between 297 and 283 BCE. Unlike the temples of Thebes or the pyramids of Giza, the library was built not by enslaved labor, but by craftsmen, many of them Greek immigrants or trained Egyptian masons, paid in coin and oil. Scribes worked in temporary tents while the scriptoria were built. Chests of scrolls were kept in clay jars, sealed with beeswax, buried beneath shaded awnings to protect them from the delta's savage heat. Every day, the structure became more real. The first stone steps were laid, wide enough for 4 people walking side by side. The roof timbers groaned into place, thick beams lashed with bronze spikes and coated in resin. Niches were carved into walls, alcoves where thousands of scrolls would soon rest, spine out, with silk bands hanging from their heads. The library's first climatic innovation was also installed. Stone ducts tunneled through the foundations, drawing cool air from shaded courtyards into the scroll vaults below. It was rudimentary air conditioning, making use of the delta's natural winds. One early visitor, writing anonymously in a letter to his brother, described the sensation of entering the hall. The air inside is cooler than the shaded groves near Canopus, and the light has a hush about it. I feel I should whisper, though I am alone. As the final stone was set atop the main entryway, Ptolemy I died, and his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, ascended the throne. He had inherited not just Egypt, but its most ambitious project, and he doubled down. Under his patronage, the book-gathering intensified. He issued a formal law. Every ship that docked in Alexandria must be searched for scrolls. The originals were kept. Beautiful copies were made and returned with thanks. If the owner protested, the crown would pay generously. Agents were sent abroad with sacks of silver and letters of royal endorsement. Their instructions were simple. Bring us everything that has been written, on every subject, in every tongue. Some scrolls came from Athens and Rhodes, others from Phoenicia, Syria, Persia, India. Entire caravans of texts, some in Aramaic, others in Egyptian hieroglyphs or Akkadian cuneiform, were brought to Alexandria. These scrolls were catalogued, copied, and preserved. The librarians became linguists, translating works into Greek, comparing dialects, inventing new words where needed. Even sacred texts arrived. A Jewish delegation from Jerusalem gifted a Hebrew Torah. 72 scholars were summoned to translate it into Greek. The result was the Septuagint, a text whose echo would last through centuries of religion and scholarship. The library's appetite was boundless. As the scrolls piled up, the original building evolved to meet new needs. Additional wings were added. The medical arcade, housing scrolls on anatomy, surgery, and medicinal plants. The mathematical cloister, where geometric diagrams were carved directly into benches for instruction. The astronomical rooftop, where scholars charted stars with instruments crafted on site. A secondary structure, the Serapeum, was added on the city's southern ridge. This would act as an annex when the main library could no longer hold its treasures. A stone portico linked the two by walkway. Scholars passed from one to the other daily, carrying wax tablets and armfuls of scrolls. Inside the vaults, scroll racks were refined, tilted shelves with rounded ends to support the curvature of the papyrus. Soft linen was wrapped around the oldest rolls to prevent cracking. Scrolls too delicate to touch were copied using mirrors and angled light. Preservation became a science. So too did acquisition. Every new scroll required verification of authorship, assessment of duplication, translation if needed, cataloging, shelving, and backup copying. And yet, As the structure expanded, it remained stunningly quiet. Only the soft murmurs of discussion, the scratch of styluses on clay, the occasional recitation of verse. The library was becoming what it was always meant to be, a living mind, with corridors for neurons and air ducts for breath. To the citizens of Alexandria, the library quickly became more than a royal project. It was a symbol, a sacred promise that ideas mattered. Sailors from Tyre and Rhodes spoke of a city where people debated physics in the street. Merchants bowed before the white gates of the Mausion. Students from Athens and Cyrene arrived with nothing but ambition, hoping for admission to its fabled walls. And above it all, not far off, another great project rose, the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the world. It guided ships into harbor. The library guided civilization, one with flame, the other with flame-shaped thought. Ptolemy II once described them together. One leads ships from storm, the other leads men from ignorance. By 270 BCE, the library housed over 400,000 scrolls. By some accounts, that number would eventually exceed 700,000. But what mattered more than number was purpose. This place was designed not just to hold books, but to illuminate the human mind, generation after generation. No matter how magnificent the library's architecture, how strong its cedar beams, or how vast its scroll collection, it needed something more profound to truly come alive, a system of thought, a way to transform chaos into order. A person to make the library not just a place of storage, but a machine of intellect. That person was Zenodotus of Ephesus, poet, grammarian, and the library's first head librarian. He was appointed by Ptolemy I, but flourished under the patronage of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who knew that collecting scrolls was only the beginning. Someone had to manage them, understand them, and wield their power. Zenodotus was not a builder of walls, but a builder of systems, and what he built, quietly and carefully, inside the colonnades of the great library, would become the DNA of all libraries to follow. By the time Zenodotus took up his post, the library's scroll collection had already surpassed 200,000. Some were neat, clearly labeled and wrapped in linen. Others came in bundles, mislabeled, anonymous, or even partial. There were duplicates of the same work under slightly different names. Scribal errors proliferated. Language variants blurred author identity. The scroll rooms, for all their majesty, had begun to resemble a scholar's nightmare. Without structure, the library would collapse under its own ambition. A house of words needed architecture, not just of stone, but of cataloguing, order, clarity. Zenodotus tackled this problem not as an administrator, but as a thinker. He began with a deceptively simple idea: alphabetical arrangement. Today, the notion of organizing by alphabet seems intuitive, even inevitable. But in the 3rd century BCE, it was radical. Scrolls had historically been grouped by subject, by city of origin, or by author's prestige. The idea that one might list authors from A to Omega, regardless of status or genre, was profoundly egalitarian and wildly efficient. Zenodotus arranged scrolls by author's name using the Greek alphabet. If multiple authors shared a name, he included patronymic's father's name or place of origin. For example, Homer of Smyrna, Homer, son of Menes, Homer of Chios. Each scroll bore a small hanging tag, called a silivos, tied with twine to the rolled scroll. The tag listed author, title, first line of text. Thus, readers could identify a scroll's content without unrolling it, a huge advancement in usability. These tags were often made of thin parchment or papyrus slips, coated lightly in oil to resist moisture. It was the ancient equivalent of a book spine. Zenodotus was not just a librarian, he was a literary editor. He is most famous for creating the first critical edition of Homer's epics, comparing multiple manuscript traditions to identify scribal errors, interpolations, regional variants. This was the first time in history that a scholar had systematically compared multiple sources to recover what might be closest to the original author's intent. To accomplish this, Zenodotus invented a notation system. He used marginal marks, dots, crescents, asterisks to flag lines that were doubtful, repetitive, absent in other versions. This was textual criticism in its infancy, and from it a new field was born, philology. Zenodotus did not stop at Homer. He edited and catalogued the works of Hesiod, Pindar, Archilochus, and dozens of playwrights whose names have since faded. His canon of literature defined what was studied for centuries afterward. Recognizing that the alphabet alone could not carry the full weight of categorization, Zenodotus began the first draft of what would later be perfected by Callimachus, the Pinakes, or tables. This was an encyclopedic subject index, listing author names, alphabetized, titles of works, number of lines, opening words, brief summaries, subject matter, place of birth, and life dates of authors. Imagine a set of scrolls serving as a search engine for every other scroll in the building. The Pinakes were so detailed that later librarians said one could walk through the entire intellectual world just by reading them. Although Zenodotus only initiated the project, his influence shaped it deeply. Later generations would refer to his schema when shelving, referencing, and copying texts. In this way, Zenodotus became the silent architect behind every scholar's search. Working with scrolls presented unique problems. Each scroll could be anywhere from 5 to 40 feet long. Reading required rolling and unrolling, often damaging the outer layers. Copying was tedious and error-prone. Two scribes might copy the same scroll and produce texts that diverged after only a few paragraphs. Zenodotus developed parallel verification. Scribes were required to copy in pairs, reading aloud and comparing lines in real time. Rare texts were copied 3 times, and the copies were reviewed by a senior scholar. Disputed passages were flagged, annotated, and sometimes set aside for later debate. The library even kept exemplar scrolls, the master version of a work, stored in a special climate-controlled chamber. All future copies were checked against these exemplars. In this way, the library's knowledge did not just grow, it refined itself. Zenodotus's own daily life was structured yet intense. Contemporary accounts suggest he woke before sunrise, often walking barefoot through the cooled halls of the library, with a lamp in hand, inspecting the scroll storage conditions. He held morning sessions with visiting scholars, debating linguistic nuances, resolving cataloging disputes, and reviewing new acquisitions. Midday was for private study, Homeric analysis, textual collation, and editorial notes. Late afternoons were spent with scribes, overseeing the training of junior librarians and copyists. He rarely left the library. He rarely needed to. The Mausion fed him, housed him, and paid his salary on royal coin. He was, in essence, the high priest of thought in the temple of the Muses. Zenodotus died sometime around 270 BCE, his exact grave unknown, but his impact remains incalculable. From his innovations sprang alphabetical shelving, book tags, author catalogues, critical editions, subject classification systems, library metadata, modern systems, ISBN numbers, Library of Congress classifications, Dewey Decimals, owe their soul to Zenodotus's silent order. Every library today, however digital or vast, still echoes his early decisions, and though his own poetry is largely lost, his greatest work was never in verse, but in making knowledge navigable. In an age that dreamed of gathering all wisdom, Zenodotus gave it form. If Zenodotus built the foundation of order in the Library of Alexandria, it was Callimachus of Cyrene who erected the architecture of its intellect. A poet by temperament and a scholar by trade, Callimachus entered the library not as a builder of stone, but as a cartographer of knowledge. His mission? To make the unknowable library knowable. His legacy would not be a single epic or one great treatise, but a monumental scholarly work that, though mostly lost, resonates through every modern library today. It was called the Pinakes. By the mid-3rd century BCE, the Library of Alexandria had grown beyond what any single scholar could comprehend. Thousands of scrolls arrived each year, brought in by ship captains, traders, royal agents, and far-flung correspondents. Some were original, others were copies, many were fragments. Texts poured in from Mesopotamia, Persia, India, Asia Minor, North Africa, the Aegean, and occasionally even from as far as the lands beyond the Black Sea. Languages multiplied, subject matter sprawled, medicine, mathematics, music, astronomy, metallurgy, magic, poetry, politics, botany, drama. The building that housed these works remained stable, but intellectually, the library teetered on the brink of informational collapse. Scholars lost precious hours just searching. They duplicated work unknowingly. They studied false attributions. They even debated whether the same author had written different texts, or whether those were two different men entirely. To fix this, the king summoned Callimachus. Callimachus was born in Cyrene, a Greek city-state in modern-day Libya, around 310 BCE. He studied under the grammarian Hermocrates and later moved to Alexandria, where his literary talent won him attention at court. Though he was appointed a senior scholar in the library, he never held the title of head librarian, yet he worked alongside them, especially under Eratosthenes, in a deep collaboration of system and science. Callimachus was a polymath. His poems range from mythic hymns to sharp, satirical epigrams, but it was his talent for categorization that would define his role in history. Where Zenodotus had alphabetized authors and flagged manuscripts, Callimachus aimed to map the entire body of human knowledge, not in verse, but in scrolls of scrolls. The word pinax in Greek means tablet, but in this case it referred to a catalogue, a written index. The Pinakes was composed of at least 120 separate scrolls, making it the longest library catalogue ever compiled in antiquity. Each scroll was like a map, divided by subject, subdivided by literary genre, then by author, then by title, then by technical data, number of lines, opening words, birthplace of author, biographical notes. The core subjects included rhetoric, law, epic and lyric poetry, tragedy and comedy, history, medicine, mathematics, natural philosophy, music, magic and divination, agriculture, religious rituals, geography. This was not simply a library tool. It was an intellectual monument. One scroll might list every known medical text, the name and life of its author, and an assessment of the quality of its translation. Another might outline the corpus of Pythagorean mathematical writings. To read the Pinnaces was to wander through the mind of civilization. Callimachus innovated in ways few modern scholars realize. In addition to titles and subjects, he gathered authorial biographies, creating miniature literary portraits. A single entry might read, Herophilos of Chalcedon, student of Praxagoras, lived in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I, author of On the Pulse, comprising 14 scrolls, begins with, It is not the body that deceives, but the physician. This was more than utility. It was an early form of intellectual history, framing a text within its time, its lineage, and its creator's life. He was among the first to insist that understanding a text meant understanding its context. He also included critical commentary, quiet judgments about whether a text was trustworthy, whether an author was famed or obscure, and which copies were more accurate. He laid the groundwork for future librarians to not just store texts, but curate them. By compiling the Pinnaces, Callimachus gave the library something it had never had before, a unified memory. Before him, scrolls had simply been stored. After him, they were networked. Scholars could now request texts by topic, search for all works by a given author, track down fragments of a poem based on its opening line, cross-reference editions, trace the influence of one writer on another. This dramatically accelerated research. Mathematics, astronomy, literature, and medicine all blossomed under this system. The Pinnaces allowed scholars to work faster, think wider, and compare deeper than ever before. It was not just a list. It was the engine behind the library's golden age. Despite its importance, not all scholars admired Callimachus's cataloguing work. One of his famous detractors was Apollonius of Rhodes, a fellow poet and author of the Argonautica. The two had a long-standing feud, with Apollonius accusing Callimachus of being overly meticulous, cold, and small-minded. Callimachus, for his part, looked down on long, Homeric-style epics, declaring, "A big book is a big evil." He believed poetry should be elegant, refined, and dense with meaning. That same attitude infused his library work, precise, exhaustive, but elegant. This tension between volume and precision, between collecting everything and curating wisely, still echoes in every academic debate about libraries today. Callimachus was not trying to hoard scrolls. He was trying to illuminate patterns of thought. Though the original Pinnaces have been lost to history, burned or scattered during Alexandria's decline, fragments survived in quotations, copies, and derivative works. They inspired the Roman libraries of Cicero and Pliny, The Byzantine Suda, a massive encyclopedia of the 10th century. The cataloguing system of Islamic libraries in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Damascus. The Latin indexing systems of medieval monasteries. And ultimately, the modern principles behind the Dewey Decimal System and Library of Congress classification. Wherever books are classified, Callimachus lingers like a ghost, quietly pointing the way. Callimachus lived a long and productive life, dying sometime around 240 BCE. He never sought fame. He never led armies or governed cities. He rarely left the library grounds. But his poems would influence Roman writers like Catullus, Propertius, and Ovid. His catalogue would influence civilizations. He once wrote, "I hate the cyclic poem. I do not drink from the great rivers, but from the little trickles." And yet, ironically, his own greatest creation, the Pinakes, became the Nile of knowledge, nourishing all who would follow. The stone walls of the library eventually fell. Fires raged. Conquerors came and went. Scrolls turned to ash, shelves to rubble. But even when the books vanished, the idea of their arrangement remained. What Zenodotus initiated, Callimachus perfected. The principle that knowledge without structure is noise. Today, when a researcher pulls a book from a library shelf, finds a citation, or searches a database, Callimachus is there, quiet, precise, eternal. The sun rises slowly over Alexandria. Before the cries of porters in the harbour, before fishmongers shout their morning prices, before the rhythmic ring of bronze hammers on ship hulls, the library is already stirring. At the edge of the Mausion complex, on a raised stone terrace overlooking the sea, a flicker of movement disturbs the stillness. A scholar, robe wrapped loosely around his shoulders, moves between columns. His sandals scrape the marble lightly. In one hand, he carries a clay lamp, its last drops of oil barely glowing in the breaking light. In the other, a wax tablet. He is not the only one awake. In the lower eastern wing of the library, where the scribes' quarters cluster like beehives around a central portico, young men begin their day. They stretch in silence, mouths still stained with sleep. Some dip cloths in cool water to wash their faces. Others sit cross-legged, already reviewing yesterday's work. Lists of scrolls copied, errors corrected, margins checked. By the time the city opens its eyes, the great library is already alive. Every morning, just after sunrise, the junior scribes, many still in their teens, gather in the copyist cloister. This is a wide, covered courtyard with polished benches arranged in arcs around an open garden of fragrant herbs, mint, thyme, lavender. It's not just for beauty. Those scents deter the insects that feast on papyrus. The scribes recite their pledge for the day. No word omitted, no word added, no truth altered. They work in pairs, one reader, one writer, to ensure fidelity. The reader carefully enunciates the original scroll, often worn and cracked from age. The writer dips his reed pen, called a calamus, into carbon ink, and transcribes the text onto a fresh roll of prepared papyrus. Every line is checked. Every margin must be clean. Mistakes are scraped away with pumice, but too many errors, and the entire scroll is discarded. The library holds no tolerance for carelessness. The head of the scribal corps, an old man named Dorian, with fingers permanently blackened by ink, moves quietly among them. He taps shoulders. He murmurs corrections. He scolds gently when needed, praises rarely. He once copied the entire histories of Herodotus by hand, twice. His reputation ensures silence. His silence ensures quality. Elsewhere in the Mouseion, resident scholars gather in the refectory, a high-ceilinged room with marble basins, ceramic jugs of fresh water, and long benches of olive wood. The fare is simple: bread sweetened with dates, bowls of lentils, goat cheese, and cups of warm barley milk. Conversation is light. Some scholars eat alone, deep in thought. Others gather in whispering clusters, discussing last night's dreams, the layout of constellations, or the politics of Pergamon. Among them are philosophers, mathematicians, grammarians, and natural scientists. Some are local, many are foreigners. They speak in Greek, but their accents betray origins in Syria, Carthage, Athens, Babylon, and Cyrene. They are united by curiosity and by royal stipend. None of them pays to eat. None pays to live. All are supported by the Ptolemaic court as an act of statecraft. In the king's view, feeding the mind feeds the kingdom. By mid-morning, they disperse to their chosen wings. Down a sun-dappled peristyle, a roofed walkway of Doric columns, a philosopher named Theon begins his daily lecture. He walks slowly, his voice low and rhythmic. Students gathered around him like fish trailing a boat. Today's topic is Plato's Republic, but tomorrow it may be the stars, or dreams, or the proper length of tragedy. One student interrupts, another counters. Theon laughs gently, pivots, and begins again. He draws diagrams in wax tablets. He quotes from memory. He pauses to let questions grow. Other groups pass by, heading to their own studies. No one hushes anyone. The Mouseion is a place of dialogue, and its stoa are its beating heart. Within the library's central vaults, scrolls are always in motion. Each scroll is shelved spine out in curved niches, sometimes behind linen curtains. A team of senior assistants, the catalogoi, manage the circulation. They retrieve scrolls requested by scholars. They shelve returns in proper alphabetical or subject order. They maintain temperature and humidity, lighting incense when needed. They inspect for mold, wormholes, and decay. When a scroll is requested, a catalogos records time of withdrawal, name of scholar, purpose of use, return condition. This may seem bureaucratic, but with nearly 500,000 scrolls, discipline ensures survival. Some scrolls are ancient, Egyptian hymns written in hieratic script, or fragments of Babylonian stargazing tablets. Others are fresh, Greek dramas, Roman treatises on agriculture, Indian arithmetic. Each day, the library becomes a living bloodstream, with scrolls pulsing through arteries of thought. In a side chamber, cool and dark, a translation team sits at work. At the head is Philotas, a polyglot originally from Tyre. He speaks fluent Aramaic, Phoenician, Egyptian, and a half-dozen dialects of Greek. Today, he's translating an herbal manual from Demotic Egyptian into Koine Greek. He reads the ancient hieroglyphic gloss, murmurs the meaning, then dictates in Greek to his assistant, who transcribes. Nearby, another team works on the Hebrew Torah, part of the famed Septuagint project. 72 scholars work in groups of 6, translating the sacred text with reverent care, reviewing their interpretations in chorus. They argue not just about words, but about meaning, context, metaphor. They are not merely copying, they are bridging worlds. In the library's southern cloister, an experiment is underway. A young anatomist named Herophilos is demonstrating the dissection of an animal heart. Around him gather a crowd of medical scholars. He discusses the structure of ventricles, the relationship between pulse and breath, the idea that the brain, not the heart, governs thought. To modern minds, this may seem mundane, but in his time, this was radical truth. Some whisper that Herophilos and his peers even dissected human bodies, prisoners condemned by royal decree. It is not officially recorded, but it is believed. Science in Alexandria is bold, sometimes ruthless. In the eastern wing, near the gardens, the poets gather. They sit cross-legged on rugs, surrounded by scrolls of Homer, Sappho, and Archilochus. A young poet named Nicaea recites her latest ode, a love song to the Nile. An elder critic interrupts, questioning the choice of meter. A grammar scholar debates her use of a rare Doric particle. She defends it fiercely. These poets do not write in isolation. They argue, rewrite, quote each other, steal lines, and invent forms. The library does not just preserve literature, it creates it. And in the evenings, they often read aloud in the stoa, under the glow of bronze oil lamps. At midday, and again at dusk, the scholars eat together. Simple, warm meals, with wine diluted in water, olives, and barley cakes. Some go for walks in the garden. Others return to their studies. A few slip away for naps, their minds overfull. At night, a strange quiet falls. Only the bravest scholars remain at their desks, working by lamplight. Some read the stars from the rooftop observatory. Others retreat into dreams. The library, too, sleeps, but lightly. Scrolls rustle as the sea breeze sneaks through half-closed shutters. A rat scurries in the storeroom. A night guard whispers prayers to Thoth, god of scribes. And somewhere, by candle's edge, a young student reads an ancient scroll, his lips moving silently. He does not know that what he copies will be read centuries later in Baghdad. He does not know that this moment is civilization in motion. He only knows that knowledge waits, and he is not yet finished. The Library of Alexandria was never content with being a great library. It wanted to be the library, the only one that mattered. This wasn't arrogance, it was policy. From the reign of Ptolemy, the first Soter, through his successors, the library was treated not as an institution, but as a national obsession, a project as grand and aggressive as any military conquest or temple-building campaign. The goal was simple, but staggering. Collect every book in the known world, in every language, on every subject, from every civilization. No parchment was too obscure, no dialect too remote, no subject too strange. The library sought to become nothing less than a mirror of human thought. To achieve this ambition, the Ptolemies developed one of the first state-sponsored book acquisition programs. Royal agents, trained scholars, translators, linguists, and diplomats were dispatched across the Mediterranean and Near East with a mission that bordered on espionage. They infiltrated book fairs in Athens, temples in Memphis, schools in Antioch, markets in Babylon, libraries in Rhodes, Pergamon, and Ephesus. Armed with scroll cases, gold coins, and royal mandates, these book hunters were empowered to buy, borrow, or copy any text they could find. In some cases, they offered generous sums. In others, they invoked Ptolemaic authority. Sometimes they simply took the book, promising to send back a faithful copy, which often happened, though not always promptly. These agents became known as the Seekers of Shadows, a nickname drawn from the idea that words once spoken live only as shadows unless preserved. One of the library's most effective strategies was perhaps its most controversial. According to later accounts, especially from Galen, the Roman physician, the Ptolemies enforced a policy whereby every ship docking at Alexandria's port was searched for scrolls. The procedure was clear. The ship's cargo was inspected. Any written material was confiscated. The scrolls were brought to the library. Official scribes copied them meticulously. The copies, not the originals, were returned to the ship owners, sometimes labeled "From the King." The originals were stored in the library. This practice was so systematic, it became part of maritime law. Sailors would warn one another, "Hide your scrolls before Alexandria." While some historians debate the consistency of this enforcement, its impact is clear. The library amassed an unparalleled collection of the world's writings, not by luck, but by law. If you had walked through the library's scroll halls in 250 BCE, what would you have found? You would have seen medical treatises by Herophilos and Erasistratus, philosophical debates of Plato, Aristotle, and Zeno, epics and hymns from Mesopotamia, written centuries earlier and translated into Greek, Indian treatises on mathematics, including early discussions of zero and infinity, Egyptian funerary texts and ritual calendars, catalogues of plants and animals, some native to distant Africa, Persian cosmology, Phoenician navigation manuals, plays, poems, and comedies from Athens, scientific works from Miletus, Syracuse, and Ephesus, translations of Buddhist sutras, according to some later traditions. In all, the library was estimated to hold between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its height. But it's not just the number, it's the breadth. No subject was too strange. It included recipes, engineering manuals, magic spells, star charts, city laws, 6 manuals, children's fables, musical notation, agricultural calendars, gymnastics regimens. This was a library of everything. The library's diversity of texts necessitated an even more powerful intellectual effort: translation. Dozens of scholars specialized in languages: Egyptian, hieroglyphic, hieratic, demotic, Aramaic, Hebrew, Old Persian, Phoenician, Sanskrit, perhaps via intermediaries, Latin, rarely at this stage, Libyan dialects, Numidian tongues. Texts were not simply translated word for word. They were interpreted, adapted, explained. Librarians annotated cultural concepts, added glossaries, explained metaphors. This process did more than preserve. It transformed ideas. Indian astronomical texts, when translated into Greek, inspired debate among Pythagorean thinkers. Babylonian eclipse tables reshaped Greek models of planetary motion. Egyptian medicine influenced Alexandrian surgery. Each scroll was a portal, not just to knowledge, but to cross-cultural reinvention. The library collected religious writings too, but did so carefully. It held the Torah, translated by 72 Jewish scholars, the Septuagint, Egyptian sacred hymns, Zoroastrian fragments, Orphic mysteries, pagan cosmologies. However, these were stored separately, often in sealed archives or restricted wings. Only senior scholars, or those granted permission by the director, could access them. The reason was caution. Religious texts carried political sensitivity. Misinterpretation could spark controversy. But the Ptolemies were willing to risk this for the sake of a complete record of belief. As one head librarian wrote, "Even false gods are true parts of man's history." Scrolls weren't just vessels for thought. They were technologies, requiring maintenance, care, and continual reproduction. A single scroll could degrade in a few decades if mishandled. So the library maintained a scriptorium with dozens of trained copyists, climate-controlled vaults using architectural airflow and cedar wood, fumigation chambers filled with thyme, mint, and vinegar, redundancy protocols, multiple copies of key texts stored in different wings, backup archives, including at the Serapeum, a satellite temple library in Alexandria. Scrolls were catalogued not just by content, but by age, condition, and linguistic family. Each carried a metadata tag, a parchment slip with author name, title, language, and origin. In this sense, the library had created something close to a scroll database. The library became a diplomatic instrument. Foreign rulers sent books as gifts. The Athenians gifted rare plays. The kings of Pergamon once offered a treatise on irrigation. Syrian scholars presented astronomical records in Aramaic. In return, the Ptolemies offered alliances, marriage arrangements, trade concessions, access to Egyptian papyrus. Thus, knowledge became currency, and the library became a bank of prestige. To have a text stored in Alexandria was to be remembered. To be forgotten by Alexandria was to vanish. Inside the library, a quiet debate simmered for decades. Was the goal to preserve all knowledge, regardless of quality, or to curate only the best? Callimachus, we recall, favored precision over bulk. He once said, "A big book is a big evil." But other scholars, especially those from Asia Minor, argued for total preservation. Who are we to judge what may become useful? This debate still echoes in modern libraries. The Alexandria model leaned, ultimately, toward totality. It was Noah's Ark for the human mind. By 200 BCE, Alexandria had become the intellectual capital of the world. Its scrolls shaped Greek philosophy, Roman law, Islamic astronomy, Christian theology, Renaissance anatomy, Enlightenment science. And yet, we know this mostly through fragments, echoes, second-hand accounts, because the library, as we'll explore in coming chapters, did not endure forever. But while it lived, it was something the world has never seen again, a conscious, royal effort to capture the entire range of human thought in one place, open to all who dared think deeply. It was the first time the world said, "Let us gather it all, so none of it is lost." The Library of Alexandria was not built solely for storage. It was built for living minds. At its core stood not just scrolls, but the Mausion, a kind of intellectual monastery where thinkers from across the known world gathered, lived, debated, and pushed the edges of what humanity knew. Unlike many courts of the ancient world, Entry into Alexandria's scholarly circle was not earned by birth or military conquest. It was earned by curiosity, intellect, and the ability to think fearlessly. The Mausion was a sanctuary, a crucible, and at times a battlefield of minds. Attached to the great library was the Mausion, from the Greek mausion, home of the muses. It was a sprawling complex, more like a modern university than a temple. Within its high stone walls were residential quarters for scholars, lecture halls with tiered stone seating, dining rooms and kitchens, gardens lined with fig and olive trees, a dissecting room and observatory, shrines to the muses, and of course, the library scroll vaults themselves. The scholars lived there full time. They ate together, debated daily, and walked through colonnades deep in conversation. It wasn't merely a place to study, it was a place to become. The Mausion attracted the intellectual elite of the ancient world. Some names have survived, others vanished, but we know they came from every corner. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a geographer, poet, mathematician, and the first person to calculate Earth's circumference with stunning accuracy. Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed shockingly that Earth revolves around the Sun 1,800 years before Copernicus. Apollonius of Rhodes, poet and scholar, known for the Argonautica and bitter rival of Callimachus. Hipparchus, early astronomer who catalogued stars and helped invent trigonometry. Herophilos, physician who studied the nervous system and mapped the brain. Each had their field. Each had their following. Together, they created a critical mass of thought, a living engine of advancement. To live in the Mausion was to devote one's entire being to knowledge. A typical day began at first light, often with a walk through the gardens. Some scholars practiced mental exercises, reciting lines from Homer or geometric formulas from Euclid. They gathered in lecture chambers, where one scholar might deliver an argument, followed by a volley of objections and counterpoints. Afternoons were quieter, reading, copying, translating, debating in small circles. Meals were shared communally, usually modest: barley, dates, cheese, and watered wine. There were no written tests, no degrees. Your ideas were your credentials. Respect came not through rank, but through contribution. Intellectual debate was not polite conversation. It was often ferocious. It was common for philosophers to engage in loud public arguments in the Stoa. Accusations of error, bias, or faulty logic flew freely. Pride was both a flaw and a fuel. Rivalries flourished. Callimachus versus Apollonius of Rhodes. Aristarchus versus the traditional astronomers. Grammarians versus poets. Physicians versus philosophers on the nature of the soul. Yet behind the barbed remarks and biting satire was mutual dependence. Scholars sharpened one another like blades on stone. It was a culture that rewarded boldness, even when it bordered on heresy. While scholars were free to think, they were also beholden to their patrons, the Ptolemaic kings. The kings provided housing, food, stipends, materials, papyrus, ink, instruments, access to restricted scrolls. But in return, the scholars were expected to produce catalogues, translations, commentaries, scientific treatises, public lectures. Political loyalty or at least neutrality. Occasionally, a scholar might offend the court with a theory too dangerous or a criticism too sharp. Some were dismissed, a few were exiled. Most, however, learned to balance brilliance with diplomacy. Mathematics thrived in Alexandria like nowhere else. Eratosthenes, for instance, used geometry and shadows to calculate Earth's circumference. His method measured the angle of the sun in Alexandria at noon on the summer solstice, knew that in Siena, now Aswan, the sun was directly overhead at the same moment, measured the distance between the two cities, used basic trigonometry to estimate Earth's curve. His answer? Just over 39,000 kilometers, astonishingly close to the modern value. Other mathematicians explored prime numbers, irrational ratios, geometric proofs, proto-algebra. They inscribed shapes in sand, debated in diagrams, and planted abstract thought in soil that still feeds us today. In quiet chambers behind closed doors, another revolution took place: Alexandrian medicine. Physicians like Herophilos and Erasistratus dissected animals, and possibly humans, with royal permission. They studied the brain as the seat of thought, the pulse as a diagnostic tool, the structure of the liver, lungs, and eye. They rejected mystical explanations and embraced anatomy. They produced detailed surgical texts, some of which influenced medicine for 1,000 years. One of Herophilos's instruments, a thin bronze probe, was found centuries later in a Roman excavation. Their writings were stored, studied, and copied by future generations, from Roman medics to Islamic physicians like Avicenna. Atop the Mausion stood a platform used for celestial observation. Here, scholars mapped the stars with naked eyes and early instruments. They catalogued constellations, plotted lunar cycles, and predicted eclipses. Most believed in a geocentric universe, but not Aristarchus. He dared to propose: the Earth orbits the sun, the stars are distant suns, the universe is vastly larger than imagined. His idea was dismissed by most, yet his scrolls remained. Centuries later, in Italy and Poland, they would be rediscovered. Ideas do not die in silence. They wait. The scholars of the Mausion may not have conquered lands or built pyramids, but their impact was deeper. They created the foundation of grammar and linguistics, defined mathematical constants, recorded planetary movements, mapped the body's systems, preserved thousands of years of earlier wisdom, and proposed ideas centuries ahead of their time. They lived simply, worked constantly, and argued incessantly. They walked marble halls not to impress, but to inquire. Their pens were their weapons, their scrolls, their legacy. The House of Living Scholars was a miracle of its time, and a model for every academy that followed. In the grand myth of the Library of Alexandria, one often imagines a sanctuary populated almost entirely by men, poets and physicians, grammarians and astronomers, their beards long, their robes flowing, their voices in perpetual debate. Yet within the very same halls, in quieter corners, history whispers another truth. Women walked those corridors. Women studied there. Women taught there. They were fewer in number, often unrecorded, occasionally ridiculed, but they were there, and some of them shaped the intellectual soul of Alexandria as surely as any man. Unlike many ancient societies, Ptolemaic Egypt allowed for an unusual degree of female participation in education, particularly in cities like Alexandria, where Greek, Egyptian, and Persian customs merged into something more fluid. In elite households, daughters were educated in Greek literature and rhetoric, music and mathematics, medicine in rare cases, astronomy and philosophical reasoning. While few women could attend the Mausion formally, some were tutored within its orbit, the daughters of philosophers, scribes, or physicians. They copied texts, argued with brothers, recited verses, even published poetry, and some went further. There are scattered records, little more than fragments, of women who worked as scribes and copyists within the library's complex. Their names are almost all lost, but their work survived. Marginal notes in flowing, compact hands, scrolls copied with an elegance unmistakably different from their male counterparts, tiny symbols in the margins, flowers, knots, sunbursts, hints of personality in a world of protocol. Some were daughters of library staff. Others were educated slaves, trained from youth to read and write with precision. A few were free women, widows of scholars, allowed to work quietly behind the scenes. They wrote in silence. History remembered in silence. One of the library's lesser-known wings housed medical treatises, hundreds of scrolls on anatomy, childbirth, herbs, surgery, and prognosis. Here, women made their presence felt. Ancient Egyptian tradition had long allowed for female physicians, especially midwives and herbalists. These traditions were preserved, translated, and studied in Alexandria, often by women themselves. There is record of a healer named Cleopatra, the physician, not to be confused with the queen, who specialized in gynecological texts and compiled a scroll known as the Book of Women's Vessels. It detailed anatomy, fertility, menstruation, and treatments drawn from both Greek and Egyptian sources. We also find reference to Philonilla of Antioch, a pharmacologist who wrote on the properties of mineral powders and oils. Her works were cited centuries later by Galen and Dioscorides. These women weren't simply assistants, they were creators of knowledge. Of all the women associated with Alexandria, one name towers above the rest: Hypatia. Born around 360 CE, centuries after the original library had declined, she lived during the Roman period of Alexandria, yet she became its most emblematic thinker, a philosopher, mathematician, astronomer, and teacher of extraordinary brilliance. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was a scholar who likely worked in the library's successor institutions. He educated his daughter, not merely as an assistant, but as a colleague. Hypatia mastered Ptolemaic astronomy, Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy, algebra and conic sections, mechanics and instrument design. She became head of the Platonic school in Alexandria, where she taught elite Roman and Egyptian students alike, men and women. Students described her as a perfect example of virtue, clothed in white robes, speaking with clarity and dignity, a woman beloved by all, save those who envied her brilliance. Hypatia's influence reached deep into Alexandria's political and spiritual life. She corresponded with Synesius of Cyrene, a Christian bishop and former student, Orestes, the Roman governor of Egypt, and leading philosophers across the Mediterranean. She advised on policy, debated with bishops, and stood as a symbol of rational thought in an increasingly unstable world. But that visibility came at a cost. In 415 CE, amid tensions between Christian and pagan factions, Hypatia became a target. A mob, incited by fanatics, dragged her from her chariot and murdered her, brutally, publicly, and with finality. Her death marked the symbolic end of Alexandria's ancient intellectual tradition. A woman, learned, eloquent, ethical, had become the final martyr of the library's long dream. Though Hypatia stands apart, she was not the only woman shaping Alexandria's mindscape. There are references, indirect, poetic, cryptic, to a poetess known only as the Sister of the Scrolls, believed to have compiled a collection of epic fragments, a philosopher's daughter who wrote commentaries on Parmenides, preserved only in scraps, several anonymous hymns to the Muses, attributed by later scholars to a woman of the Mausion. They are ghosts now, their names washed away like ink in floodwater, but their footprints remain, in structure, in phrasing, in the very shape of the margins. Despite patriarchal norms, Alexandria offered something rare for ancient women: possibility. Its blend of cultures, Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Jewish, created pockets of flexibility. Wealthy women could host salons. Priestesses contributed to temple archives. Widows of scholars sometimes inherited scrolls and continued their study. The museum precinct, while male-dominated, was not impenetrable, and the very nature of scrollwork, quiet, precise, intellectual, allowed some women to embed themselves in the scholarly machinery. Alexandria was not egalitarian, but it was permeable. The women of Alexandria left few monuments, no statues, no tombs adorned with laurels or scrolls, yet their influence lingers. In the tone of a medical scroll, a woman's hand is heard. In the refrain of a hymn, her voice resonates. In the sharp critique of an anonymous commentary, her wit survives. They were never the majority. They were rarely acknowledged, but they were part of the library, as surely as the marble, as surely as the papyrus, as surely as the light falling across columns in the morning. Hypatia once said, "Reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all." That line became her epitaph, etched not in stone, but in memory. The women of Alexandria remind us that knowledge has never been gendered, even if history often was. They remind us that the search for truth is not the domain of the strong, the loud, or the well-born, but of the curious, the patient, the brave. And they remind us that in every library, in every classroom, in every mind that dares to question, they are still walking the halls. For decades, perhaps centuries, the Library of Alexandria had stood like a jewel of the ancient world, a sanctuary of knowledge, visited by scholars, protected by kings, admired by foreign dignitaries. But in the ancient world, permanence was a myth. Even stone crumbles, even scrolls burn. In 48 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar landed on the Egyptian coast, not as a conqueror, but as a man entangled in the final struggles of the Roman Republic. Caesar had pursued Pompey the Great across the Mediterranean. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, and then his bitter rival, fled to Egypt. He hoped to gain asylum with the boy king Ptolemy XIII. Instead, Pompey was murdered on the shore, his severed head presented to Caesar as a gift. But it was a miscalculation. Caesar wept when he saw it, and Egypt's internal politics were about to explode. Caught between rival siblings, Ptolemy XIII and his sister wife Cleopatra VII, Caesar found himself drawn into Alexandria's royal struggle. The city, normally a place of poetry and science, now bristled with soldiers, politics, and tension. When Ptolemy's forces attacked the Roman quarter, Caesar responded by fortifying himself in the palace district, which included, according to several sources, the royal harbour near the library. Alexandria became a war zone. Streets were barricaded. The harbour became a theatre of fire. Roman ships docked along the shore, set ablaze, the flames leaping unpredictably with the wind. As fire raced across the docks, it spread inland, and with it, panic. Ancient accounts diverge on what happened next. The Roman historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, tells us, when the enemy tried to cut off his communication by sea, Caesar was forced to repel the danger by fire, which spread from the dockyards and destroyed the great library. This is the first recorded claim that the great library itself burned in Caesar's siege. Other accounts, including Dio Cassius, echo this version, suggesting that warehouses of books and scrolls stored near the harbour were lost. But the degree of damage remains hotly debated. Some modern scholars argue that only a portion of the library was destroyed during Caesar's siege, particularly scroll depositories stored near the docks, perhaps awaiting cataloguing or shipment. According to Seneca, the Roman philosopher, some 40,000 scrolls were lost in the fire, but the main library within the Mausion precinct may have survived intact. If so, the tragedy of 48 BCE was not total, but it was a deep wound. A portion of humanity's memory had been scorched by war. Whether partial or complete, the destruction during Caesar's time became the first symbolic death of the library. For the first time, people imagined that even Alexandria, the mind of the ancient world, could bleed. In plays, poems, and later histories, the image of scrolls reduced to ash became iconic. Flames curling around racks of papyrus, scholars weeping beside smouldering ruins. The loss of ancient secrets, recipes, poems, theorems vanished forever. The library had always promised eternity. Fire had reminded the world of its fragility. After the siege, Cleopatra VII, now Caesar's ally and lover, sought to restore Alexandria's damaged intellectual life. It is believed she invested in repairs to the library complex. Some sources claim Caesar later gifted her 200,000 scrolls from Roman collections to help replenish what was lost. The truth of that claim is uncertain, but what is clear is this. Under Cleopatra's rule, and later Mark Antony, Alexandria's scholarly light flickered back to life, though perhaps not as brightly. The library endured, but a shadow had fallen over it. Some scholars argue that the library may have suffered earlier damage, even before Caesar. Alexandria had seen riots between Greeks and native Egyptians, earthquakes, political purges under earlier Ptolemies. Any of these could have damaged scrolls, altered collections, or silenced scholars. But if they did, no record survives. The fire of 48 BCE became the first definitive scar, and perhaps the most vivid reminder that knowledge and power do not always coexist peacefully. After Caesar's departure and Cleopatra's brief renaissance, the library continued, but with fewer resources, fewer scholars, and more uncertainty. Scrolls lost were often irreplaceable, the last copies of Babylonian astronomy, lost tragedies from the golden age of Greek theatre, treatises on medicine and botany known only by title. When a scroll burned, it took with it the author's voice, the translator's labor, the scribe's years of effort, and the reader's hope. Every blackened corner of parchment was a funeral for thought. Though the library had survived, its vulnerability was now exposed. In later centuries, it would suffer further indignities under Christian zealots, Roman emperors, and Islamic conquerors. But it was in 48 BCE that the world first saw the unimaginable, the burning of knowledge, and ever since it has haunted us. Each time we speak of Alexandria, we remember not just its brilliance, but its burning. Each library built since then has echoed its architecture and its cautionary tale. After Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, a truth became evident to the guardians of Alexandria's wisdom. No library is invincible. And so began a quiet, strategic movement, not of people, but of pages. The library's directors, scribes, and royal advisors likely asked themselves, if Alexandria falls again, where will the words go? The answer was simple: elsewhere. In a world without printing presses or cloud storage, scrolls could not be duplicated en masse, but they could be copied selectively, transported discreetly, hidden deliberately. And so the library began to create backups. The most prominent of these repositories was the Serapeum, a grand temple located in the Rakotis district of Alexandria, built in honor of Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian deity designed to unify cultures under Ptolemaic rule. Though a religious site, the Serapeum held a significant scroll collection, possibly serving as an overflow facility for the main library, a curated archive of religious, philosophical, or scientific texts, a mirror collection, duplicates housed away from the Mausion. The Serapeum's structure was fortified, its walls thick, its columns massive. Unlike the Mausion, it was not exposed to the harbor's fire-prone docks. This made it an ideal place to shelter knowledge. While exact records are lost, ancient references suggest that the Serapeum held Greek philosophical works, translations of Egyptian temple scrolls, scientific treatises copied from the main library, oracular and mystical texts of both Greek and Egyptian origin, possibly a copy of Callimachus's Pinakes, the catalogue of all known scrolls. It may also have preserved scrolls deemed controversial, such as pagan cosmologies, heretical philosophical writings, apocryphal religious texts. In essence, the Serapeum became a shadow library, both sacred and subversive. The dispersal of knowledge wasn't limited to Alexandria. As political tides shifted and instability grew, scholars and librarians likely took it upon themselves to send copies abroad, including to Pergamon in Asia Minor, home to a rival library, Antioch and Ephesus, cities with significant scholarly communities, Athens, where philosophical schools still thrived, Byblos and Tyre, ancient Phoenician cities known for scroll work, Rome, where libraries were gaining prestige under imperial patronage. Some scrolls were sent as diplomatic gifts, others were smuggled, wrapped in wool, or stuffed into amphorae, carried by merchant ships or caravans, often without labels, known only to those who had memorized their form. Not all knowledge was stored in institutions. Across Alexandria, especially in elite Greek households, private libraries flourished. Wealthy philosophers, physicians, and grammarians often maintained collections of Homeric epics, legal codices, medical manuals, plays by Euripides and Sophocles, scrolls of personal correspondence with scholars abroad. These homes became micro-libraries, less grand, but more agile. When threats arose, scrolls could be moved overnight, hidden in cisterns, transported to villas in the Delta or villas in Cyprus. In this way, Alexandria's memory spread like seeds, quietly and widely. By the early Christian era, as Christianity grew and pagan traditions waned, much of Alexandria's scholarship was absorbed by a new class of custodians, Christian monastics. Monasteries across Egypt, from the Nitrian desert to Coptic strongholds in the south, became havens of scribal culture. Some monks preserved classical texts, not out of reverence, but for their grammatical and linguistic value, tools for understanding scripture. Others, however, genuinely valued the ancient world's wisdom. They copied scrolls onto codices, early books made from parchment, often writing over older texts, a practice known as palimpsesting, but sometimes preserving them whole. In this way, parts of Alexandria's knowledge entered a new phase, sacred, cautious survival. Alexandria's Jewish population, centered in the Delta Quarter, also contributed to the dispersion of knowledge. They were responsible for the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, a monumental work of translation and scholarship that emerged from within Alexandria's multilingual ecosystem. Some Jewish scribes, aware of growing tensions between Roman and Alexandrian authorities, likely moved religious and philosophical texts to Jerusalem, Qumran, or Babylon. It's even speculated that scrolls found in the Dead Sea caves might have been influenced by Alexandrian editions, though this remains debated. Regardless, the movement of knowledge through religious diaspora was a vital artery in Alexandria's preservation story. As Alexandria fell further under Roman control, some of its surviving texts were likely relocated to Rome. The Roman emperors, especially Augustus, saw the value in intellectual capital. Libraries in the Palatine Hill, the Temple of Apollo, the Baths of Trajan, the Forum of Peace, grew fat on imported knowledge, some of which likely originated in Egypt. Roman scholars such as Galen, Pliny the Elder, and Vitruvius frequently cited Alexandrian sources, even when those scrolls had long since vanished. In Rome, knowledge was politicized, used to strengthen empire, impress guests, and rival Greek intellectual heritage. But it also, inadvertently, gave Alexandria a second life. By the 3rd century CE, Alexandria was no longer a single building housing all the world's thought. Instead, the library had become a diaspora of minds, fragments scattered across continents, scholars citing other scholars, books referencing long-lost works. In this way, the library transcended itself. It became a network, a lineage, a series of echoes, from Egyptian monasteries to Roman baths, from desert scriptoriums to Byzantine cathedrals. The scrolls continue to speak, often indirectly, occasionally misquoted, but undeniably present. The phrase, "the library was destroyed," is both true and incomplete. Yes, the walls crumbled. Yes, the scrolls burned. Yes, the Mausion became a ghost. But its knowledge, like water poured into many vessels, survived in pieces. In a medical paragraph quoted by Galen, in an astronomical diagram redrawn by Islamic scholars in Baghdad, in a footnote in a medieval Latin text, in a preserved margin in a Coptic codex. The library died, but its ideas went into exile, and many of them still live. By the 4th century CE, the Library of Alexandria no longer burned brightly. The grand days of the Mausion, the scholarly rivalries, and the scroll-saturated walls had dimmed. The Roman Empire had changed. So had Alexandria. Christianity, once persecuted, was now the empire's spiritual backbone, and with this new power came new suspicion toward pagans, philosophers, and the institutions of old learning. The library had long survived through adaptation, weathering wars, regimes, and shifting kings, but now it faced something more dangerous: ideological erasure. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE with the Edict of Milan, the landscape of Alexandria began to shift. Over the next decades, pagan temples were shuttered. Imperial support for philosophy waned. Pagan professors lost funding and protection. Religious tensions exploded into street battles. Alexandria became a battleground between Christian zealots, Jewish communities, and the last pagan intellectuals. The city that once welcomed all voices became a place of silenced dissent. At the center of this cultural collision stood the Serapeum, the once glorious temple of Serapis, and one of the last refugees of Alexandrian learning. Though originally a religious structure, it had long doubled as a repository of texts, a house of philosophy, and a sanctuary for those still aligned with the classical world. But in 391 CE, under Emperor Theodosius I, all pagan temples across the empire were ordered closed. In Alexandria, this edict was enforced with brutal enthusiasm. Led by Patriarch Theophilus, a powerful and charismatic Christian bishop, mobs descended on the Serapeum. Ancient accounts, including those of Socrates Scholasticus, describe how the building was stormed. Statues of Serapis were shattered. Altars were torn apart. Scrolls were confiscated, scattered, or destroyed. The temple itself was razed. Some scrolls may have been spared, but many were consumed by fire, trampled, or lost in the chaos. And with that, the last significant bastion of Alexandrian learning fell. It's important to recognize not all Christians celebrated the destruction, but the tide of history was moving swiftly. The early church often viewed pagan philosophy with suspicion. Aristotle and Plato were reinterpreted through theology. Astronomy was seen as dangerous speculation. Classical myths were recast as heresy. In this new world, scrolls without saints were scrolls without worth. The Serapeum had been more than stone and parchment. It had been a symbol, and that symbol was now ashes. The tragedy didn't end with stone and fire. In 415 CE, Hypatia of Alexandria, philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer, was murdered by a Christian mob. As previously told, she had been a revered teacher and symbol of pagan learning, but her position, intellectual, independent, and politically connected, made her a target. Dragged from her chariot, she was beaten to death, her body dismembered, her remains burned. With her died not just a brilliant mind, but the last living embodiment of the library's spirit. It was not just a killing, it was an execution of an idea. No one knows exactly how many scrolls the Serapeum housed at the time of its destruction. Estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000. Among them could have been lost plays by Euripides and Aeschylus, commentaries by early astronomers, ancient maps of the stars, Babylonian astronomical records, Egyptian temple chronicles, Buddhist texts translated through trade networks. These weren't merely books, they were threads of thought stretching across continents, languages, and centuries, and many of them ended in fire. Over time, legends simplified the library's demise into a single apocalyptic blaze, often blamed on Caesar, Christians, or Muslims. But the truth is more tragic. The library died in phases, partly during Caesar's siege, 48 BCE, again during Aurelian's war, 270 CE, again under Theophilus, 391 CE, finally with Hypatia's death, 1415 CE. Each phase took a limb, a memory, a voice, until nothing remained but echoes. By the 5th century CE, Alexandria was no longer a city of scrolls and scholars. The Mausion was gone. The Serapeum was gone. The thinkers were scattered, silenced, or converted. And though other centers of learning would rise, Baghdad, Cordoba, Constantinople, the unique experiment that had been Alexandria was over. The stacks stood empty, and silence reigned. The final flames of Alexandria remind us of something uncomfortable. Knowledge can be lost, not just misplaced, but obliterated, not just forgotten, but forbidden. And the loss isn't only cultural, it's existential. For each scroll burned, a question went unanswered, a cure went undiscovered, a story went untold. But memory, though fragile, is also persistent. And today, when we rebuild libraries, digitize texts, translate forgotten languages, and resist censorship, we do so in defiance of those final flames. When the Library of Alexandria fell, not in a single moment, but in waves of destruction and neglect, it would be tempting to imagine a complete and utter annihilation, a void where knowledge once lived. But that is not how memory works. Ideas migrate. They take shelter in mines, in monasteries, in marginalia. They change shape, language, purpose, and survive. Alexandria's light did not die. It refracted, scattering across the ancient world like starlight behind storm clouds. Centuries after the library's fall, a new intellectual power began to rise, the Islamic Golden Age. Starting in the 8th century, scholars across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cordoba, became the new stewards of ancient thought. They translated Greek texts into Arabic, preserving works that had vanished from Europe. Among these were Ptolemy's Almagest, Galen's medical writings, Euclid's Elements, Aristotle's Logic and Metaphysics, Platonic dialogues. Many of these texts had roots in Alexandrian scholarship, copied by hand, passed eastward, reborn in new alphabets. In Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, a center known as Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was established. There, scholars like al-Kindi, al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, Al-Khwarizmi, studied and expanded upon ancient knowledge. They didn't merely preserve scrolls, they transformed them. Greek arithmetic became algebra. Alexandrian medicine was woven into Islamic medical compendiums. Astronomical charts from Ptolemy were corrected and expanded upon. Philosophy was married with theology in dazzling intellectual syntheses. It was Alexandria's voice, speaking Arabic, in cities lit by minarets instead of lighthouses. This resurrection of knowledge was made possible by a monumental effort, the translation movement. Greek, Syriac, Sanskrit, Persian, all were translated into Arabic. These translations were not always exact. They were commented on, questioned, annotated. Sometimes scribes would write in the margins, "This argument is weak," or "Compare with Galen's view in folio 212. It was a living dialogue, one where Alexandrian ideas were treated as starting points, not commandments. In the Islamic world, Alexandria never fully died. Meanwhile, in the Christian West, another quiet form of preservation endured, the monasteries of Europe. Though many classical texts were lost in the fall of Rome, some survived in the scriptoria of Ireland, Italy, Gaul, the Byzantine Empire. Monks, often unaware of the grandeur of Alexandria, copied texts in silence, works of Cicero and Virgil, fragments of Greek science. Later, Roman compendiums that quoted Alexandrian scholars. Often, they copied a copy of a copy, layered echoes, growing fainter with each generation, but never silent. In places like Toledo, Cordoba, and Palermo, where Islamic, Jewish, and Christian cultures coexisted, a second great translation movement began in the 11th and 12th centuries. Arabic texts, many of which had preserved Greek ideas, were translated into Latin. From Alexandria to Baghdad to Toledo to Paris, an unbroken, if winding, chain. Through this conduit, the West rediscovered Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and with these rediscoveries came revolutions in medicine, architecture, philosophy, and science. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe began to awaken intellectually, not purely from within, but through this recovered memory. Humanists and scholars such as Petrarch, Leonardo, da Vinci, Copernicus, Newton, would all, in time, benefit from the aftershocks of Alexandrian learning. Da Vinci's anatomical drawings echoed Herophilos. Copernicus built upon Aristarchus's heliocentric whispers. Newton's calculus bore the distant scent of Eratosthenes' measurements. Alexandria's afterlife was not in ashes, it was in acceleration. Jewish thinkers, too, played a pivotal role in preserving and transmitting ancient wisdom. In the multicultural hubs of Cordoba, Fez, Cairo, Tiberias, rabbis and scholars engaged in the cross-cultural dialogue of ideas. Figures like Maimonides, educated in Cairo, wrote extensively in Arabic, drawing from Aristotelian logic, Galenic medicine, Alexandrian commentaries. Through these writings, Jewish thought carried Alexandrian DNA long after the city had fallen silent. Not all ideas survived intact. Much of Alexandria's genius lives now in fragments, a medical term, a mathematical proof, a star chart, a grammatical rule. Many scrolls are known only by title, mentioned in another work, lost forever. Yet in archaeology, even a fossil tells a story, and in philosophy, even a footnote can launch revolutions. What matters is that the essence of curiosity survived, the hunger for precision, the embrace of contradiction, the patience to measure a shadow and deduce the earth's size. These things lived on. Today, there is no original scroll from the Library of Alexandria, no signature of Callimachus, no ink from the hand of Hypatia, nothing you can hold. And yet, it lives. In every university, in every archive, in every observatory, in every library, great or small. Each one is a reincarnation, a promise, a defiance of forgetting. The Library of Alexandria died a physical death, but its soul migrated into history itself, and there it thrives.